Well, for all those first graders who just cannot stop learning, here is Knowledge 11. It's called Frontier Explorers. Listen to what's in this before you say, I don't want to hear that. Listen. You're going to learn about Daniel Boone and the opening of the West, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, Presidents Jefferson and Monroe, something called the Louisiana Purchase, which is incredibly important, and two fellows named Lewis and Clark. You're going to hear about discovery and danger on the prairie, a woman named Sacagawea, red cedars and grizzly bears, rivers and mountains, to the Pacific Ocean and back. Altogether, that's 11 lessons. And you know what? I have never read these lessons before. So, let's get started. It's an adventure for both of us. Okay, this is about how the United States got to be so big. Because think about it, we were originally 13 colonies. How in the world did we stretch all the way across the North American continent? Well, listen carefully, because you're going to find out that there were people who wanted to see what was on the other side of the Mississippi River, but first they had a big barrier. A barrier is like something that's in the way. You have to get around. And that was the Appalachian Mountains, which basically form a gigantic wall of mountains for a lot of the country. And it runs from the north down to the south. So, today people from all over the world live together in communities from one end of North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and everywhere in between. What you're looking at now is a map of North America that shows the United States in green. That's an awful lot bigger than the 13 colonies, don't you think? You can see lots of white lines outlining the states that make up our country, the United States. However, hundreds of years ago, the United States was a lot smaller than it is today. Well, you know that long ago, the only people who lived on the continent of North America were people known as Native Americans. Native Americans have lived in America, North America, for thousands of years, way before Christopher Columbus. Native Americans lived in both seasonal and in permanent villages. They used great knowledge of the land and its resources to create a great number of villages and cultures. There were tens of millions of them. Now, at the same time, far away on the other side of the ocean, many people had their own towns and villages. You see that big map there of the world. These people lived on the continent of Europe and were known as Europeans. If you need help, have someone point to where Europe is before I go on. Okay, about 600 years ago, Europeans began to leave their lands and sail to other parts of the world. They were looking for spices, they were looking for gold, and other things that would make them rich. Some of these explorers arrived in North America. Imagine how surprised Native Americans and Europeans must have been to see each other. People who looked, dressed, and spoke very differently from themselves. The early explorers who came to North America were mostly interested in finding things, goods and riches that they could take back to Europe to sell. Many of these explorers learned vital skills from Native Americans who knew the land very well. Vital skills are skills that are very important to your survival. Native Americans taught the Europeans many skills, including hunting, fishing, gathering, and farming. In exchange for their help, Europeans brought things to trade with Native Americans, such as cloth. And for many years, Europeans traveled back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, some Europeans were content or satisfied to just trade with Native Americans. but others became interested in starting settlements because they wanted to live on the continent as well. Now remember, settlements are places where people make their homes in a new area. The English started two settlements in North America in the 1600s. Plymouth in what is now Massachusetts and Jamestown in what is now Virginia. And at Plymouth, Native Americans helped the settlers survive. Do you remember how at Plymouth they celebrated their harvest together, the first Thanksgiving in America? The Europeans would not have been able to grow the corn and squash for that meal without help from the Native Americans. As time passed, more and more Europeans came to live in North America, often encroaching on Native American land. Encroaching means gradually taking Native American land. Fights over the land arose. Eventually, settlers claimed most of the land on the east coast of North America, which is land where the Native Americans had lived for many years. Now, the word claimed here means that the settlers said the land belonged to them, even though the Native Americans had been living on that land for thousands of years. So the English formed colonies, or settlements controlled by faraway England, from Massachusetts all the way to Georgia. Now, eventually, some of the more adventuresome settlers wanted to explore land to the west of them. To the west is going to your left on the map. One of these people was a young man by the name of Daniel Boone. Kind of looks like one of those Declaration of Independence type guys, doesn't he? Well, he was born in 1734. Near the town of Reading, Pennsylvania, was Daniel Boone. His father and mother owned a farm. Daniel and his brothers and sisters all helped their parents plow the fields on the farm. But Daniel was never content in the open fields. He was curious about life in the woods around their farm and spent as much time as possible creating paths through the forest. He made friends with young Native American boys who lived in the wooded areas. They taught Daniel how to move quietly through the forest and how to trap wild animals and catch fish in the streams. Daniel learned how to use a knife and a tomahawk at an early age. His father, seeing how interested Daniel was in hunting, taught Daniel how to use a special type of gun called a rifle. Now, one day, while helping his father plow the fields, Daniel asked if he could be allowed to help out the family in another way. "Father," he said, "since you taught me to shoot a rifle, I have practiced and practiced until I am the best shot for miles around. Let me hunt for food for our family." Daniel's father agreed, and soon the Boones were feasting on wild turkey and deer. In 1750, just before Daniel turned 16, the Boone family moved from Pennsylvania to the Yadkin River Valley in North Carolina, settling at the edge of the frontier. Now, it didn't take long for the other settlers in this new home to discover that Daniel was one of the best woodsmen for miles around. Daniel began to explore his new surroundings. His explorations took him deep into the forests. He heard tales of buffalo to the west, and he wanted to try hunting other animals than the plentiful deer and bear that lived in the woods nearby. But Daniel was unable to go as far west as he wanted to go. Something was stopping him and other settlers from traveling farther west. Can you guess what it was? Well, there were mountains, enormous mountains, standing in his way. These mountains are called the Appalachian Mountains, and they stretch for miles from the present-day state of Maine all the way to Georgia. The mountains were heavily wooded, making them difficult to cross. They formed a natural barrier and blocked movement from one side of the mountains to the other. For this reason, few European settlers had left their colonies along the eastern coast of North America to travel west. But Daniel knew that Native Americans had crossed these mountains for years. So as he roamed through the densely forested hillsides, his curiosity about lands to the west grew stronger. Daniel began to ask everyone he met if they knew a way to cross those mountains. Okay, before we get to the next lesson, in that read aloud you heard that the Appalachian Mountains formed a natural barrier. Say that word, barrier. A barrier is something that blocks movement from one place to another. A barrier can be a natural barrier or man-made. Like the police set up a barrier to block the road during the investigation. Or the road crew, after digging a hole in the middle of the road, had to put up a barrier around the hole so that cars didn't drive into it. Sometimes, if you come to a large, wide river and there's no bridge across it, that river would be a barrier to you going any further. Okay, so that's a good word to know. Anyway, think, where did Daniel Boone live? And what kept the English settlers from moving west across North America? Think about those things. Okay, see you for lesson 2.